I'm Chris Taylor. I'm a Professor of Education Policy in WISERD. The evaluation has been commissioned by the Welsh Government to look into the impact and delivery of the Pupil Deprivation Grant. And the Pupil Deprivation Grant is the equivalent of the pupil premium that we find that exists in England, which is an intervention which gives additional money to schools, primary and secondary schools, for every pupil who is eligible for free school meals. In other words, that means they're from families with low incomes, with the principal aim of closing the attainment gap between children from free school meal families with other children. At the moment, that gap is quite large and highlights the detriment of difficult, challenging socio-economic circumstances on children's lives and their educational attainment. If that gap didn't exist, then we'd be confident that the education system serves all children equally and they all have equal opportunities. But while that gap remains, there is a clear need to alleviate and mitigate the impact of socio-economic circumstances on that. And this Pupil Deprivation Grant is designed to give additional resources for schools to facilitate that mitigation. The evaluation is just over 2 years. There was an initial scoping study which is now complete and has been reported to the Welsh Government, which was to find out and test out some of the evaluation materials. The evaluation has several parts to it. One key part is to use existing data, the National Pupil Database, to look at the impact of the Pupil Deprivation Grant on children's achievements, and to see whether there has been a closing of the gap. The second key part of the study is to identify from schools themselves how they're spending the grant, how they understand the purposes of the grant, and where they get the evidence from in choosing the interventions that they then apply in how they spend the resources. That will be a large-scale mapping exercise of schools across Wales, let's say primary and secondary schools. And then we'll be doing some smaller number of detailed case studies, which will involve visiting the schools, talking to the teachers and head teachers and the children about the interventions, looking at what's being introduced, and finding out a bit more information about the choice of interventions that they're applying. Lastly, we're also interested in the impact of the grant on other areas of children's development, including their well-being and their attendance at school. Finally, the evaluation will be reporting to the Welsh Government in terms of its outcomes, but it will also be designed to help the Welsh Government and schools develop best practice in terms of interventions that appear to better close the gap or mitigate the effects of socioeconomic disadvantage within the context of Wales. There's already an enormous amount of information available through the Education Endowment Fund and the Sutton Trust Toolkit, which applies largely to the pupil premium in England, but that toolkit is being encouraged by the Welsh Government to be used by schools and regional consortia, but we're very interested to see what impact those interventions have in the context of Wales. And of course they may have different impacts, and one of our outcomes will be to see to what extent schools can reproduce the same findings. What's unique about this particular evaluation, this intervention, is that it's a direct policy response to the impact of pupil deprivation. It gives additional resource directly to the schools that have those children in it. It directly targets the educational attainment of those children, and is different from previous attempts to alleviate the impacts of socioeconomic disadvantage through more perhaps area-based responses or school-wide responses. For example, in Wales we also have the School Effectiveness Grant, which is additional money that schools receive to help improve educational attainment. But that School Effectiveness Grant applies to raising the attainment of all children within the school, whereas this grant specifically directs its attention to a group of children who are identified as being in need because they are eligible for free school meals. That criteria is self-problematic. Schools will identify other children who are also in need, but the key thing here is that the targeting of this intervention for those children is because they live in low levels of income or high levels of poverty. And that the idea is that irrespective of how well they do now, they could have done better or greater if they had received this intervention and the support that that the schools can now offer them. The evaluation is going to be crucially important because obviously there's a large amount of money being spent on this intervention. It not only is interested in the impact of the grant itself, but the extent to which schools themselves understand the challenges of the children that they're educating, the extent to which schools and the regional consortia have the capacity to develop new tools and new interventions that directly impact upon those children's lives. And thirdly, in terms of then being able to report that and evaluate it, to what extent can they demonstrate the impact of those interventions on educational attainment? These aims are clearly central to the Welsh Government's policy directive towards education. Not only is it about raising standards, literacy and numeracy, but very centrally in terms of alleviating the impacts of disadvantage and closing the gap between these two, or between various groups of children in the system. The evaluation is 2 years long. There will be an annual report after the first year, and then there'll be a final evaluation report at the end of the second year. The design of the study means that there'll be various bits of the study that we will report on at various times during the course of the study. So there'll be an initial analysis of the National Pupil Database. That will be reported on, then we'll reanalyse it with another sweep of data the following year, so that will be updated. We intend to we've done a scoping study report already, which was based on 20 interviews with schools and head teachers across Wales to get a sense of what information they already have available to them. We've attended regional consortia coordinators for the Pupil Deprivation Grant to find out what they're currently doing and how they go about that, and again those findings have already been reported in the scoping study report. As the phases of the evaluation go forward, I'm sure that these things will be, the findings from these phases will be reported by the Welsh Government, published by them in due course. The pupil premium in England, which is the equivalent of this intervention, although it brings more money to schools in England, has already been evaluated, and they found significant progress amongst many schools in terms of closing the educational attainment gap between children from free school meal backgrounds. But that evaluation also highlighted that there's some way to go in terms of schools' understanding of the evidence and the interventions that they need and ought to apply within their school. So there's variation in implementation. So we're hoping to build on that in this evaluation. But I see that this work will lead into various other projects in terms of knowing more about the circumstances and challenges that children face when entering the education system, differences between the primary and secondary sector in terms of raising or alleviating the educational attainment gap, and in terms of using new data sets collected by the Welsh Government, including the new national literacy and numeracy test data, which has only just been undertaken, and the first year's national test results are only just going to be available in the autumn of 2013. So the evaluation allows us to explore that data for the first time too.